The afternoon sun streamed through the tall windows of Clarence's house, casting long shadows across the Persian rugs that adorned the sitting room. William stood near the mahogany bookshelf, his fingers absently tracing the spine of a leather-bound volume, while his mind wandered to the pressing matters that had brought him here today. The house felt unusually quiet, with only the distant sound of footsteps echoing through the corridors. He had arrived unannounced, a habit he had developed over the years when family matters required immediate attention. Today's visit was particularly important. His father Charles had been experiencing concerning health episodes lately, and William felt it was his responsibility as heir to ensure everything was being properly managed. The weight of future kingship pressed heavily on his shoulders, especially during moments like these when his father's mortality became starkly apparent. Camilla had greeted him warmly at the door, her smile bright but somehow strained around the edges. She wore a cream-colored cardigan over a floral dress, her hair perfectly styled as always, yet there was something in her demeanor that struck William as odd. Perhaps it was the way her eyes darted away when she spoke, or how her hands seemed to flutter nervously as she gestured toward the sitting room. "Charles is resting upstairs," she had explained, her voice carrying its usual warmth, but with an undertone William couldn't quite identify. "The doctor visited this morning and suggested he take things easy for the remainder of the day. You know how stubborn your father can be about following medical advice." William nodded, understanding all too well his father's tendency to push through discomfort rather than acknowledge any signs of weakness. It was both an admirable quality and a source of constant worry for the family. The responsibilities of the crown never seemed to pause for human frailty, and Charles had always been acutely aware of this burden. The sitting room where William now waited was a reflection of both Charles and Camilla's tastes, traditional yet comfortable, formal yet lived in. Photographs of family gatherings dotted the various tables, including several featuring William's own children during happier, more carefree moments. The sight of these images reminded him of the importance of family unity, especially during challenging times. As he continued to wait, William noticed certain details that seemed out of place. There were papers scattered across Charles's usual writing desk, hastily organized as if someone had been sorting through them quickly. A teacup sat abandoned on the side table, still half full and growing cold. Most peculiar was a manila envelope that protruded slightly from beneath a stack of official correspondence, its corner visible and marked with what appeared to be a legal firm's letterhead. The sound of Camilla's heels clicking against the hardwood floor announced her return. She entered carrying a silver tray with tea service, her movements graceful yet somehow hurried. As she set the tray down on the coffee table, William noticed her hands trembling slightly, so subtle that someone less observant might have missed it entirely. "I thought you might appreciate some refreshment while we wait," Camilla said, her voice maintaining its characteristic pleasantness. "Charles should be down shortly. He was quite eager to see you when I mentioned you'd arrived." William accepted the offered cup, noting how Camilla's fingers brushed against his briefly during the exchange. Her skin felt unusually cold despite the warmth of the room. He studied her face more carefully, observing the careful way she had applied her makeup, perhaps a bit more concealer than usual around her eyes, as if covering signs of sleepless nights. "How has father been, really?" William asked, settling into his chair and fixing Camilla with a direct gaze. "I know the official reports speak of minor fatigue, but I sense there might be more to the situation than what's being publicly acknowledged." Camilla's smile faltered for just a moment before she recovered her composure. She busied herself with arranging the tea service, her movements deliberate and measured. "Your father is as determined as ever," she replied carefully. "Though I must admit, the recent episodes have been concerning. The doctors are conducting additional tests to ensure we have a complete picture of his condition." The word episodes hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that neither seemed willing to address directly. William set down his teacup and leaned forward slightly, his expression growing more serious. The afternoon light had shifted, casting the room in a different hue that somehow made everything feel more urgent. "What kind of episodes, Camilla?" William pressed gently but firmly. "I need to understand what we're dealing with. The family needs to be prepared for any eventuality, and that requires complete transparency about Father's health." Before Camilla could respond, a distant sound from upstairs caught both their attention. It was faint but unmistakable, the sound of someone struggling to breathe, followed by what might have been a cough or something more alarming. Camilla's face went pale, and she rose quickly from her chair, her carefully maintained composure finally cracking. "I should check on him," she said, moving toward the door with obvious urgency. "Perhaps you could wait here for just a moment?" But William was already standing, his own concern overriding any sense of propriety or protocol. "I'm coming with you," he stated firmly, following Camilla toward the staircase. The sound from above had stopped, but the silence that followed felt even more ominous than the initial distress. As they climbed the stairs together, William noticed how Camilla's breathing had become shallow and rapid. Her hand gripped the banister with white knuckles, and she kept glancing back at him with an expression that seemed to combine worry with something else, something that looked almost like guilt. The upper hallway was dimly lit, with heavy curtains drawn across most of the windows. The carpet beneath their feet muffled their footsteps as they approached the master bedroom. Camilla hesitated at the door, her hand hovering over the ornate handle as if she were steeling herself for whatever they might find on the other side. "Charles," she called softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Charles, are you all right? William is here to see you." The response from within was weak, but audible, a voice that sounded strained and somewhat breathless. "Come in," Charles managed to say, though the words seemed to cost him considerable effort. Camilla opened the door slowly, and William followed her into the bedroom. The sight that greeted them was both reassuring and deeply concerning. Charles was sitting propped up in bed, his face flushed and his breathing clearly labored. Several pillows supported him in an upright position, and there was a glass of water and what appeared to be medication on the nightstand beside him. "Father," William said, moving quickly to the bedside. "What's happening? Should I call for medical assistance?" Charles waved his hand dismissively, though the gesture seemed to exhaust him further. "Just a bit of difficulty catching my breath," he said between shallow inhalations. "Nothing that warrants making a fuss about." But William could see that this was far more than a minor breathing difficulty. His father's lips had a slightly blue tinge, and there were beads of perspiration on his forehead, despite the room's comfortable temperature. Most alarming was the way Charles seemed to be working so hard just to draw each breath, as if the simple act of breathing had become a conscious effort requiring all his concentration. Camilla moved to the other side of the bed, her movements quick and practiced as if this scenario had played out before. She reached for a small device on the nightstand, what appeared to be some kind of inhaler or breathing apparatus. Her familiarity with the equipment suggested that Charles's breathing difficulties were not as rare or minor as he was attempting to portray. "How long has this been going on?" William asked, dividing his attention between his father's condition and Camilla's surprisingly efficient response to the situation. "And please don't tell me this is the first time. It's clear you both know exactly what to do." The room fell silent, except for the sound of Charles's labored breathing. Camilla and Charles exchanged a look that spoke volumes, a silent communication between two people who had been keeping secrets and were now faced with the possibility of having those secrets exposed. As William watched this wordless exchange between his father and stepmother, he began to realize that there was far more going on here than a simple health scare. The way Camilla's eyes darted nervously around the room, the practiced efficiency of her response to Charles's breathing difficulties, and, most importantly, the guilty expression that both of them wore suggested that they had been concealing the true extent of Charles's condition. The afternoon sun continued to stream through the bedroom windows, but the atmosphere in the room had grown heavy and tense. William felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature, as if the very air around them had turned cold with the weight of unspoken truths. It was then that William noticed something that made his blood run cold. On Camilla's nightstand, partially hidden beneath a silk scarf, was a folder marked with the royal family's private physician's seal. But what caught his attention wasn't the folder itself. It was the paper that had slipped out from beneath it, revealing a single word that made his heart skip: terminal. The implications of that single word began to cascade through William's mind like falling dominoes. If his father's condition was terminal, why hadn't he been informed? Why was this information being kept secret? And what other secrets might Camilla be hiding? As these thoughts raced through his mind, William began to understand that this afternoon was going to reveal far more than just concerns about his father's health. The careful way Camilla had greeted him, her nervous behavior, the hastily organized papers downstairs, everything suddenly took on a different meaning. The room seemed to grow colder by the moment, and William realized that he was about to uncover secrets that would change everything he thought he knew about his family. The afternoon that had begun with simple concern for his father's well-being was about to become something much more complex and potentially devastating. Charles continued to struggle for air, his breathing becoming increasingly labored, while Camilla maintained her position beside him with the efficiency of someone who had been managing this crisis in secret. And William stood frozen, processing the reality that his father might be dying and that Camilla had been keeping this monumental secret from the rest of the family. The weight of future responsibility pressed down on William's shoulders with renewed force. If Charles was indeed terminally ill, then William's ascension to the throne was no longer a distant possibility, but an immediate reality. Yet instead of being prepared for this transition, he was discovering it through accidental observation rather than trusted communication. As the silence stretched on, punctuated only by Charles's difficult breathing, William knew that the next few moments would determine not just his father's immediate well-being, but the future of the entire royal family. The secrets that were about to be revealed would test every relationship and challenge every assumption he had held about the people closest to him. The room had indeed turned icy, but not from any change in temperature. The coldness came from the dawning realization that trust had been broken, secrets had been kept, and nothing would ever be the same again. The silence that followed William's discovery of the medical folder stretched like a taut wire about to snap. Charles's breathing had stabilized somewhat with Camilla's assistance, but the tension in the room had only intensified. William's mind raced as he processed the implications of what he had just glimpsed, while Camilla seemed to be calculating how much damage control might still be possible. "Father," William said finally, his voice steady despite the turmoil churning within him, "I think it's time we had an honest conversation about what's really happening here." Charles looked up at his son with eyes that held a mixture of resignation and relief. The burden of keeping secrets had clearly been weighing heavily on him, and perhaps the prospect of finally sharing the truth offered some small comfort. He gestured weakly toward the chair beside the bed, indicating that William should sit down. "I suppose you've seen more than we intended," Charles said, his voice still strained but clearer than before. "Camilla tried to keep you from discovering the full extent of things, not out of malice, but because I asked her to protect the family from unnecessary worry." Camilla moved nervously around the room, straightening objects that didn't need straightening, her anxiety manifesting in restless motion. She kept glancing between Charles and William as if trying to gauge how much damage had already been done to their careful deception. "The doctors have been quite thorough in their assessments," Charles continued, pausing frequently to catch his breath. "The prognosis is not what any of us had hoped for. The breathing difficulties you witnessed are just one aspect of a more comprehensive condition that has been developing over several months." William felt his world shifting beneath him as his father's words confirmed his worst fears. The folder marked terminal had not been a mistake or a misunderstanding. His father was indeed dying, and this knowledge had been kept from him and presumably from the rest of the family as well. "How long?" William asked simply, the question containing multitudes of meaning. How long had his father known? How long did he have left? How long had they been planning to keep this secret? The doctors initially gave us a timeline of perhaps 6 to 8 months, Camilla interjected, speaking for the first time since they had entered the bedroom. That was 3 months ago. We wanted to wait until we had explored all possible treatment options before sharing this burden with the family. The revelation hit William like a physical blow. 3 months of secrets, 3 months of pretending everything was normal while his father slowly died, and Camilla orchestrated an elaborate deception to keep the truth hidden. The implications for the monarchy, for the family, and for William's own future were staggering. All possible treatment options? William repeated, his voice taking on a sharper edge. Or were you hoping to find a way to manage the succession without involving me in the process? The accusation hung in the air like a challenge. Charles and Camilla exchanged another of their meaningful looks, and William realized that his suspicion had struck closer to home than he had even imagined. There had indeed been discussions about the succession, planning that had taken place without his knowledge or input. William, you must understand, Charles began, but his son held up a hand to stop him. No, father. I think I'm beginning to understand more than you realize. William stood up from the chair and began pacing the room, his mind working through the connections he was starting to make. The papers scattered on your desk downstairs, the way Camilla greeted me today, the fact that you've been conducting secret medical consultations. This isn't just about hiding your illness, is it? Camilla had stopped her nervous tidying and was now standing perfectly still, watching William with an expression of growing alarm. Charles struggled to sit up straighter in bed, clearly recognizing that their carefully constructed wall of secrets was beginning to crumble. There are certain arrangements that needed to be made, Charles admitted reluctantly. Preparations for the transition that would be necessary regardless of the timeline. Camilla has been helping me ensure that everything is properly organized for when the time comes. What kind of arrangements? William demanded, his voice rising slightly despite his efforts to remain calm. What decisions have been made about my future, about the future of the crown, without consulting me? The room felt electric with tension as the three of them faced the reality that could no longer be hidden or managed through careful omissions. William could see that both his father and stepmother were struggling with how much truth to reveal, and their hesitation only fueled his growing suspicion that there were even deeper secrets yet to be uncovered. Show me, William said firmly, extending his hand toward the medical folder that lay on Camilla's nightstand. I want to see everything. No more protection from unnecessary worry. No more managing my reactions. If I'm going to be king, then I need to know exactly what I'm inheriting and when. Camilla looked to Charles for guidance, but he had closed his eyes and seemed to be gathering strength for what was to come. The weight of months of deception had clearly exhausted him beyond just the physical toll of his illness. The folder contains more than just medical reports, Camilla said quietly, her voice barely audible. There are legal documents, succession planning papers, and recommendations from various advisors about how to manage the transition period. Recommendations about managing me. You mean, William corrected, his understanding of the situation crystallizing with painful clarity. You've been planning how to control my ascension to the throne, haven't you? Planning how to ensure that certain influences remain in place after father's death. The accusation struck home with devastating accuracy. Camilla's face went pale, and Charles opened his eyes to look at his son with an expression that combined guilt with a desperate need to explain. It wasn't about control, Charles said weakly. It was about ensuring stability during a difficult transition. The monarchy requires continuity, and there are so many moving pieces that need to be coordinated carefully. Stability? For whom? William asked pointedly. Continuity of what, exactly? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you've been making decisions about my reign before it's even begun, consulting with advisors and legal experts while keeping the future king completely in the dark. The truth of William's words seemed to echo through the room, and for the first time since his arrival, Camilla appeared to realize just how serious the situation had become. Her careful management of information and gentle manipulation of circumstances had backfired spectacularly, exposing not just the medical secrets, but the deeper betrayal of trust that had been taking place. The legal documents, William continued, his voice growing colder with each revelation. What do they contain? What powers are you trying to preserve or transfer? What roles are being defined for people who should have no role in my reign? Charles struggled to find words that might repair the damage that had been done. But it was becoming clear that the scope of the deception was too vast to be easily explained away. The breathing difficulties that had initially brought William upstairs now seemed almost minor compared to the suffocating weight of the secrets that were being revealed. There are provisions for regency, Camilla finally admitted, her voice so quiet it was almost a whisper. Temporary measures to ensure that if your father's condition deteriorates rapidly, there would be established protocols for maintaining governmental continuity. Regency involving whom? William demanded, though he suspected he already knew the answer. The silence that followed was answer enough. William felt the blood drain from his face as he realized the full scope of what had been planned without his knowledge. Not only had they hidden the terminal nature of his father's illness, but they had been making arrangements for a regency that would potentially delay or complicate his ascension to the throne. You've been planning to govern in my place, William said, the words coming out flat and cold. You've been setting up a system where you would maintain control during the transition period, making decisions about when I would be deemed ready to assume full royal responsibilities. Charles tried to protest, but William cut him off with a gesture. The young prince had heard enough to understand the basic framework of the deception, and each new detail only served to deepen his sense of betrayal. How many other people know? William asked. Who else has been involved in planning my future without consulting me? Which advisors, which legal experts, which government officials have been party to these secret arrangements? The questions came rapidly, each one revealing another layer of the conspiracy that had been woven around him. William began to understand that what he had initially perceived as concern for his father's health was actually part of a much more complex web of political and personal maneuvering. The Prime Minister's office has been consulted, Charles admitted reluctantly. Certain key advisors have been briefed on the medical situation and the potential timeline for transition. It was necessary to ensure that governmental functions could continue smoothly regardless of how quickly events might develop. Governmental functions, William repeated bitterly. And what about family functions? What about trust, honesty, and preparing the future monarch for the responsibilities he's about to inherit? Did those considerations factor into your careful planning? The room had indeed grown icy, but the coldness now came from the complete breakdown of trust between father and son. William could see his entire future being reshaped by secrets and machinations that had been carefully hidden from him, and the realization was both infuriating and deeply hurtful. As Charles struggled with another bout of difficult breathing, William found himself torn between his genuine concern for his father's well-being and his anger at the deception that had been perpetrated against him. The medical crisis was real and serious, but it had been used as a cover for political maneuvering that went far beyond simple health concerns. Camilla stood frozen beside the bed, watching the confrontation unfold with growing alarm. She had clearly underestimated William's ability to piece together the various elements of their deception, and now found herself facing the collapse of months of careful planning and manipulation. There's more, isn't there? William said, his voice carrying a note of grim certainty. This isn't the end of what you've been hiding from me. What else have you arranged? What other surprises am I going to discover? The question hung in the air like a threat, and William could see from their expressions that his suspicions were correct. The medical folder, the succession planning, and the regency arrangements were just the beginning of a much larger and more complicated web of secrets that was about to be exposed. The afternoon sun was beginning to fade outside the bedroom windows, casting long shadows across the room where three people sat surrounded by the wreckage of broken trust and shattered assumptions. What had begun as a simple visit to check on his father's health had become a revelation that would change everything William thought he knew about his family and his future. The weight of unspoken truths pressed down on the room like a physical force. William could feel his pulse quickening as he realized that everything he had discovered so far was merely the tip of an iceberg that threatened to sink not just his relationship with his father and stepmother, but potentially the very foundations of his future reign. The medical folder in his hands felt like it contained the fragments of his shattered trust. "I want to see all of it," William said, his voice carrying a quiet authority that seemed to surprise even him. "Every document, every legal opinion, every secret arrangement that has been made. If you've been planning my life without my knowledge, then I have the right to understand exactly what you've decided for me." Charles's breathing had become more labored again, but whether from his medical condition or from the stress of the confrontation was impossible to determine. Camilla moved toward a large wardrobe in the corner of the room, her movements reluctant but resigned. The time for partial truths and careful omissions had clearly passed. "There's a safe behind the mirror," Camilla said quietly, her voice carrying defeat. "The combination is your grandmother's birthday. Your father insisted on that particular date, though I'm not sure any of us realized how prophetic that choice would become." As Camilla opened the hidden safe, William felt a chill run down his spine that had nothing to do with the temperature in the room. The reference to his grandmother's birthday was loaded with implications about legacy, tradition, and the weight of royal responsibility that was about to fall on his shoulders much sooner than anyone had anticipated. The contents of the safe were more extensive than William had imagined. Camilla withdrew several thick folders, each marked with different color tabs and official seals. There were documents from the royal family's private legal team, correspondence with government officials, medical reports from multiple specialists, and what appeared to be detailed timeline projections for various scenarios. "The blue folder contains the medical consultations," Camilla explained, her voice mechanical, as if she were reading from script. "The green folder has the constitutional legal opinions about regency procedures and succession protocols. The red folder contains correspondence with the Prime Minister's office and key government departments about transition planning." William accepted the folders with hands that trembled slightly despite his efforts to maintain composure. Each document represented another layer of deception, another decision made without his input, another assumption about his capabilities and readiness to assume the throne. As he began reading through the medical reports, the full scope of his father's condition became devastatingly clear. The terminal diagnosis was not a recent development, as William had initially thought. The first concerning symptoms had appeared almost a year ago, and the medical team had been tracking a steady decline in Charles's condition for months. "A year," William said, looking up from the documents with disbelief. "You've known about this for almost a year, and you said nothing to me. How many family gatherings have we had where I asked about father's health, and you assure me everything was fine? How many times have I made plans for the future based on the assumption that we had time?" The accusation hit both Charles and Camilla with visible impact. The year-long deception suddenly seemed even more inexcusable when viewed through the lens of all the missed opportunities for honest conversation and genuine preparation. "We thought there might be treatment options," Charles managed to say between difficult breaths. "Experimental procedures, alternative therapies, anything that might change the prognosis. We didn't want to cause unnecessary alarm if there was still hope for recovery." "Unnecessary alarm," William repeated, his voice growing colder with each word. "Is that what you call preparing the future king for his responsibilities? Is that what you call giving me time to understand the magnitude of what I'm about to inherit?" The green folder contained even more disturbing revelations. The constitutional legal opinions outlined detailed procedures for a regency that would remain in effect not just during Charles's illness, but potentially for an extended period after his death. The recommendations suggested that William might benefit from a transition period, during which experienced advisors would help guide his early decisions as monarch. Who wrote these recommendations? William asked, holding up a particularly detailed memo about the advantages of maintaining continuity through experienced royal advisors. Who decided that I would need this kind of supervision during my early reign? Camilla and Charles exchanged another of their meaningful looks, and William could see that this question touched on perhaps the most sensitive aspect of their secret planning. The implications were clear. Someone had been making judgments about William's readiness to rule, and those judgments had informed the development of systems designed to limit his independence as king. The recommendations came from a committee of advisors, Camilla said carefully. People who have served the royal family for decades and who understand the complexities of royal transitions. Their concern was simply to ensure that the monarchy remained stable during what could be a very challenging period. A committee I was never consulted about, William pointed out. A committee that made assessments about my capabilities without ever speaking to me directly. A committee that apparently decided I would need to be managed rather than supported during my transition to the throne. The red folder contained the most shocking revelations of all. The correspondence with government officials revealed that plans had been made for announcing Charles's death in a way that would emphasize continuity and gradual transition rather than immediate change. There were draft speeches that referenced the wisdom of experienced guidance and the importance of measured decision-making during periods of royal change. You were planning to announce my father's death as an opportunity for continued regency, William said, his voice barely containing his rage. You were going to use his funeral as a platform for explaining why I shouldn't immediately assume full royal powers. The silence that followed was deafening. Charles closed his eyes as if the weight of his son's discoveries was too much to bear, while Camilla stood frozen beside the bed, clearly recognizing that every secret they had worked so hard to protect had now been exposed in the most damaging possible way. The intention was never to undermine your authority, Charles said weakly. The intention was to protect the monarchy during a vulnerable period. The advisors were concerned about the potential for instability if the transition happened too quickly or without proper support systems in place. Support systems that I was never allowed to evaluate or approve, William responded. Protection that was developed without my knowledge or consent. You've been treating me like a child who needs to be managed rather than like the future king who deserves to understand and shape his own destiny. As William continued reading through the documents, he discovered evidence of financial arrangements that had been made without his knowledge. There were provisions for maintaining certain advisory positions, generous compensation packages for key staff members, and what appeared to be efforts to ensure that particular influences would remain in place regardless of any changes William might want to implement. You've been buying loyalty, William said, his voice filled with disgust. You've been creating financial incentives for people to maintain the systems you've established, making it difficult or expensive for me to make changes when I become king. The room felt arctic now, not just from the broken trust, but from the recognition that William's entire future had been shaped by people who claimed to love him, but had systematically excluded him from the most important decisions about his own life. The breathing difficulties that had initially brought him upstairs seemed trivial compared to the suffocating realization that he had been living in a carefully constructed illusion. How many other people know about all of this? William asked, gesturing toward the pile of documents. How many staff members, advisors, and government officials have been briefed on these plans? How many people have been watching me for the past year, evaluating my readiness, discussing my capabilities behind my back? The question revealed perhaps the most painful aspect of the entire situation. William realized that he had been unknowingly performing for an audience of evaluators, people who had been measuring his words and actions against secret criteria while he remained completely unaware of their assessment process. The circle of knowledge was kept deliberately small, Camilla said, her voice barely audible. Only the most essential people were involved, and everyone was sworn to absolute secrecy. The goal was to minimize the potential for leaks while ensuring that necessary preparations could be made. Essential people, William repeated bitterly. Everyone except the person whose life and reign were being planned. everyone except the future king himself. As the full scope of the deception became clear, William felt something fundamental shift inside him. The relationship he had thought he had with his father and stepmother was revealed to be based on lies and manipulation. The trust that had formed the foundation of their family dynamic had been systematically undermined by months of secret planning and careful omissions. Charles's breathing became increasingly distressed as the confrontation continued, but William found it difficult to separate his genuine concern for his father's health from his anger about the deception. The medical crisis was real, but it had been used as a tool for manipulation and control. "What happens now?" William asked, his voice carrying a note of finality. "Now that all your careful planning has been exposed, now that I understand exactly what you've been doing, how do you expect this to proceed?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. The room that had turned icy with broken trust now felt like a battlefield where the future of the monarchy would be determined not by tradition or protocol, but by the ability of three people to navigate the wreckage of their shattered relationships. Camilla sank into a chair beside the bed, the weight of the exposed secrets finally overwhelming her carefully maintained composure. Charles struggled to find words that might begin to repair the damage that had been done, but it was becoming clear that some betrayals are too. As the afternoon faded into evening, William stood surrounded by the documents that revealed the true extent of the conspiracy that had been woven around his life. The medical folder, the legal opinions, the government correspondence, and the financial arrangements painted a picture of systematic deception that challenged everything he had believed about his family and his future. The room was indeed icy now, frozen by the recognition that trust, once broken, might never be fully restored. William understood that he was no longer just discovering his father's secrets. He was discovering who he would need to become in order to reclaim control of his own destiny and restore integrity to the crown that he would soon inherit. The breathing difficulties, the hidden documents, and the year-long deception had all led to this moment of reckoning. As Charles struggled for air and Camilla faced the collapse of her carefully constructed plans, William realized that his real education in kingship was just beginning, and it would require him to be stronger, more independent, and more decisive than anyone had believed he could be.